The bracelet surfaced on a Tuesday morning at the tail end of a long, wet week. Workers in neon vests were dismantling the rusted skeleton of the old slide, a twisted piece of metal that had stood in the playground for over 3 decades. The ground beneath was soft from rain, churned into dark clumps by the backhoe. One worker, kicking aside a pile of earth where the slide's concrete footing had been, noticed a glimmer against the mud. At first it looked like scrap wire or the ring pull from a soda can, the kind of detritus that always turned up when digging in old parks. But when he bent down and tugged it loose, it was unmistakable, a child's bracelet, delicate, strung with tiny beads spelling out a name. The name was hers, the sister's, the one who, along with her younger brother, had vanished from this very playground in 1991. The bracelet was bent, its cord frayed, the beads dulled and stained. But the letters were still visible, lined up like an accusation after 34 years of silence. The worker stood frozen, the bracelet hanging limply between his fingers, mud dripping from its edges. Another worker noticed and muttered, "Oh God, not here," before backing away, as if the soil itself had just confessed something terrible. Within hours, the site was cordoned off with tape that fluttered in the drizzle. Parents who brought their children to the park were told to leave. A camera phone video of police arriving spread quickly online, and by the evening, the story had already begun to circulate again, after so many years of being little more than a whispered ghost in town. The bracelet was not just a trinket, it was evidence, physical proof that the children had been here, in this dirt, at the time they disappeared. It mocked the official conclusion that no trace had ever been found. For those who remembered 1991, the bracelet was like a wound ripped open. The siblings' faces had been everywhere back then, on milk cartons, stapled to telephone poles, taped to shop windows. They were the kind of kids who should have been unremarkable, anonymous in the hum of summer play. She had been 8, old enough to look after her brother. He had been 6, still small enough to cling to her hand as they ran across the grass. They had come to this playground one bright July afternoon, their mother sitting on a bench with a paperback. When she looked up again, they were gone, vanished. No witnesses, no clear trail, only a town's stunned disbelief. The official story, repeated for decades, was that the trail went cold within hours, that the children were likely taken by someone passing through, that no clues remained in the playground. That was why the bracelet's sudden appearance in 2025 struck like a thunderclap. If the soil had been turned over in the original investigation, why had no one seen it? If the area had been searched as thoroughly as claimed, why was a personal item, so clearly tied to one of the missing, still embedded in the dirt beneath the slide? The find did not just reopen the case, it reopened memory. For the mother, now frail and nearly housebound, the bracelet was both gift and curse. For her, it was proof her daughter had been here, perhaps longer than anyone admitted. For the town, it was a reminder of unanswered questions and unspoken suspicions, that maybe the truth had been buried deliberately. The bracelet sat on an evidence tray that night, under fluorescent light, photographed from every angle. Mud still clung between the beads and the cord was stiff with age. But when zoomed in, the letters spelled the same name that had stared from posters in every shop window in 1991. For decades, the slide had been climbed, sat upon, and rusted through while this small piece of truth waited just inches below. And now, as workers rebuilt the playground for a new generation, the earth itself had chosen to return it. The town had lived with the story for so long that it had become part of its landscape, like the cracked sidewalks or the hollowed-out mill on the edge of Main Street. By 2025, most people spoke of the siblings in half-sentences, if they spoke at all. It was easier not to stir the wound. Yet when the bracelet appeared, the silence fractured, and memories seeped back out into the open. Old neighbors who had long since stopped talking began to recall the atmosphere of those days. They described how, after the children vanished, fear blanketed the community like heavy fog. Parents kept their kids inside. Windows were nailed shut. The playground, once filled with shrieks of laughter, stood deserted. Some people had tried to fight forgetting. A few families kept boxes tucked away in attics. Brittle newspapers with headlines about the lost two, faded ribbons from vigils tied around telephone poles, cassette tapes of radio call-in shows where residents begged for answers. A woman who had been a teenager in 1991 pulled out a backpack she'd found near the schoolyard that summer, dismissed by police as unrelated, but still saved in her closet. She had never thrown it away because deep down she didn't believe it was nothing. Another resident carefully unwrapped a plastic sleeve containing one of the original flyers, yellowed and curling at the edges. The photograph of the siblings was grainy, their eyes black dots, but the caption beneath still demanded, "Missing, last seen at playground." Everyone remembered how loud the town had been at first. Reporters, helicopters, press conferences on the courthouse steps, and then, just as quickly, it all evaporated. By autumn of 1991, the case had gone cold, and with it, the noise. Parents learned to smile tightly and avoid the subject. Schools stopped holding assemblies. Even the local papers turned their attention back to council meetings and football games. The absence became normalized, tucked away in a corner of collective memory, until eventually, talking about it felt like reopening a wound that never healed. The town chose to bury it, just as the bracelet had been buried in the dirt. The survivors of that silence, friends who had played tag with the siblings, mothers who had stood on the same benches chatting in the summer air, carried the weight differently. Some admitted to seeing shadows out of the corner of their eyes when they walked by the playground. Others confessed that the sound of a child's laughter could still bring tears without warning, and a few, like the children's own cousin, never stopped keeping small shrines, boxes of letters, school drawings, half-torn photographs. To them, forgetting was a kind of betrayal. When the bracelet reappeared, these hidden relics were brought into the light. A living room table became crowded with objects. A cracked lunchbox, a lock of hair sealed in an envelope, a clipping with the mother's desperate plea from 992. Each item was both personal and communal, a piece of grief preserved against time. The intimacy of these artifacts reminded everyone that the story wasn't abstract, wasn't just a cold case number. It had been lived, suffered, endured in the quiet. For 34 years, the town had survived by closing its mouth. Now, with the bracelet in the headlines, the silence felt impossible to maintain. The belongings, once tucked away in drawers and attics, became voices of their own, whispering insistently that the story had never really ended. It had only been waiting. The first time the investigators stepped onto the playground, it was almost disappointingly ordinary. Children's laughter rang out from the new swing set. Parents leaned against benches scrolling on their phones, and the bright plastic of the recently installed jungle gym gleamed in the sunlight. To a casual eye, it was just another small-town park, the kind of place that had been rebuilt countless times over the years. But the investigators weren't looking for the surface. They carried maps, aerial photos, and copies of the original site plans, comparing every corner of the present playground to what had stood here in 1991. They started with the slide. The new structure stood a few feet away from where the old one had been. Tracing outlines on their documents, they discovered the footprint of the original slide was still visible, marked by a rectangular patch of ground where the grass grew a different shade. Near that spot, the soil looked oddly uneven, a subtle rise that didn't match the rest of the field. The texture underfoot was looser than it should have been for earth that had supposedly sat undisturbed for decades. One investigator crouched down, scooped a handful, and let it fall through his fingers. The grit was darker, clumped with fragments of concrete and rust flakes, as though the earth had been mixed, disturbed, and packed down again sometime after 1991. The senses were assaulted by the small details most visitors would ignore. Rust streaks stained the concrete at the base of the swings, older than the structures themselves. A faint metallic odor hung in the air, sharper near the spot where the bracelet had been unearthed. When they pressed their ears against the ground in certain places, the sound changed, a hollow thud instead of the muffled density of untouched earth. One investigator tapped with the end of a shovel, listening carefully. "There's space underneath," he whispered, though no one responded. The more they walked, the more the playground seemed to resist them. The laughter of children playing on the new equipment clashed cruelly with the gravity of their task. Every creak of a swing chain, every thud of a foot hitting the mulch, carried an echo of what had been lost here. It became hard to concentrate on the paperwork in hand when the setting itself demanded attention. The benches were the same style as in the early photos. The tree line hadn't changed much in 3 decades, only thicker now. From certain angles, it was easy to imagine the siblings running between those trees, climbing those structures, before vanishing into a void that seemed to have swallowed them whole. Then came the first anomaly, a corroded light fixture, still bolted to a pole at the far end of the park, bore a manufacturer's stamp indicating it was installed in 1994, 3 years after the disappearance. The issue wasn't its age, but its wiring. The electrical conduit ran underground, directly beneath the old slide's location, a strange design choice since there had been no lighting recorded in that section of the park during its active years. This meant work had been done there quietly, after the official search had concluded. Work no one remembered requesting. It was a small discovery, easy to dismiss if taken in isolation. But the contradiction gnawed at them. If the ground had been disturbed for wiring in 1994, why wasn't it documented? Why had the soil beneath the slide looked freshly packed even decades later? And why, if authorities had declared the area thoroughly examined, did every step into the dirt reveal a new thread of inconsistency? The playground, outwardly bright and inviting, began to feel less like a public space and more like a sealed room. Every cheerful noise became background static, masking the sense that something was hidden directly beneath their feet. The investigators marked the map with careful notes, already sensing that the official story, that nothing of importance was ever found here, it would not survive scrutiny. The posters were never meant to last. They had been slapped to telephone poles and taped to grocery store windows in the frantic days after the children vanished, printed in cheap black ink on thin paper that curled under the summer sun. Yet decades later, a few had survived in drawers, folders, and boxes where grief-stricken families had tucked them away. When they were laid out on a table for the first time in years, their fragility was immediately obvious. The paper had browned, edges flaking, the images so faded that the siblings' eyes were little more than dark smudges. But the words beneath still shouted, "Missing, last seen July 1991. What startled the investigators wasn't the deterioration of time, but the inconsistencies. One poster bore a phone number to the sheriff's office, while another, printed only a day later, listed a different number. This one routed through the local school district. Families recalled how posters had appeared in sudden waves, covering the town overnight, but no one had ever clearly known who coordinated them. Parents had assumed it was the police. Others had believed it was volunteers. When the discrepancy was pointed out, the surviving cousin frowned and shook her head. "We always thought it was strange," she said quietly. "The ones we handed out weren't the same as the ones we saw on storefronts. It was like someone replaced them." A deeper look at the printing revealed faint differences in typeface and formatting. One flyer listed the boy's name first, the other the girl's. Even the dates varied slightly. July 12th in one version, July 13th in another. Officially, the children disappeared on the 12th. Why then would a version circulate with the 13th? When questioned, some residents swore they remembered the 13th because it was the day after a town fair. Others insisted it had to be the 12th because they recalled hearing the mother scream that very evening. The posters, instead of clarifying the timeline, blurred it further, muddying memory with conflicting dates stamped into ink. Forensic inspection of the paper stock showed 2 different suppliers. One set bore a faint watermark from a regional print shop that had closed in the late 1990s. The other had no watermark at all, printed on a grade of paper common to bulk government orders. The unsettling implication was that the first wave of posters had likely been community-driven, raw and urgent. while the second wave had been issued from some institutional hand. If that was true, it meant that someone with authority had deliberately altered the information the public relied on, even if only by a day or a phone number. The family members' memories added weight to this unease. The mother had kept a stack of posters in her closet for years, and she remembered waking one morning to find the town plastered with new versions that were not hers. No one had asked permission, no one had informed her. She had stood in front of a storefront window, staring at the flyer with her children's faces, and realized it was not the one she had approved. It felt like they had taken them away from me all over again, she admitted, her voice breaking. On the table, the mismatched posters became artifacts of distortion. The names, faces, and pleas were the same, but the details had been tampered with, subtly reshaped. To the casual eye, they were duplicates, but to those who had lived the nightmare, they were proof that someone else had controlled the narrative almost from the beginning. The question lingered like a low hum. If even the missing posters couldn't be trusted, what else from 1991 had been altered before reaching the public? The paper trail began, not in some dusty warehouse of records, but in the fluorescent-lit clerk's office, where rows of binders and digital terminals promised order. On the surface, the case files looked meticulous, typed reports, logs of calls, official stamps in blue ink. Yet the more carefully the investigators combed through them, the more the cracks widened. A single sheet from July 1991 listed a patrol car dispatched to the playground at 7:12 p.m., responding to lost children, but the dispatch log for the same day was conspicuously blank, as though the call had never existed. When asked, the clerk shrugged and said the paper files had been digitized in the late 1990s, and things sometimes got lost. It was an answer too convenient to be comforting. Digging deeper, they uncovered maintenance records tied to the playground. A set of meeting minutes from the school board showed an urgent vote on July 15, 1991, approving site maintenance and upgrades, yet no invoices, receipts, or contractor names followed. The very next month, August, a new playground budget line appeared. Allocated funds were marked as completed, but again, no evidence of actual work was filed. The investigators pressed. If the playground had been upgraded, where were the contracts? Where were the work orders? Silence hung in the office until one archivist admitted in a low voice, "Some files from that summer went missing years ago." The deeper they went, the stranger it became. Permits for lighting installation bore 2 date stamps, one from July 1991 and another from September 1994, the same permit, duplicated with different years, both filed under the same project code. A forensic glance at the ink suggested that the earlier stamp might have been added. Later, the impression lighter, almost hesitant. If true, it meant the records weren't just incomplete. They had been manipulated. What rattled them most wasn't the missing paperwork, but the rhythm of absence. Entire folders for July 10th. Through July 13, 1991, the critical window when the children vanished were gone. The ledger skipped from the 9th to the 14th as if the days had been sliced clean out of history. Clerks offered explanations, boxes misplaced in a flood, misfiled during digitization, maybe purged under an old retention policy. But when pressed to show evidence of such policies or the alleged flood, nothing materialized. Alongside the missing documents, small anomalies glimmered like shards of glass. A maintenance order written in pencil rather than ink. A file folder labeled Slide Repair that contained only a single sheet, unsigned and undated. An internal memo describing grounds disturbance with no author. No letterhead, no follow-up. Each item on its own might have been brushed aside as clerical error. Together, they painted the outline of intentional erasure. As one investigator spread the papers across a long table, the weight of what they were seeing began to settle in. The official record of 1991 was not only incomplete but selectively incomplete. Someone had decided which details survived and which vanished, and the details missing, the maintenance orders, the dispatch logs, the days surrounding the disappearance, were precisely the ones most critical to reconstructing the truth. The contradictions couldn't be ignored. Either the authorities had been unforgivably careless in preserving the record of two vanished children, or they had chosen to scrub the archive clean. Both possibilities were damning. And yet, staring at the empty spaces where pages should have been, the investigators knew they had stumbled into something larger than simple negligence. The paper trail was no longer a source of clarity. It had become evidence of the cover itself. He agreed to meet only on the condition that his name never be used. His voice altered if the footage was ever shown. They found him in a corner booth of a highway diner, the kind of place where the coffee was burnt and the hum of neon-masked low conversations. He was older now, hair gone silver, shoulders hunched under the weight of time and things unsaid. When he slid into the booth, he kept his eyes fixed on the Formica table, not on the investigators. The first words out of his mouth were not a greeting, but a warning. "You're stirring something that was meant to stay buried." He had been a young patrolman in 1991, barely 2 years on the job. The call had come in just after dusk, 2 children missing from the playground. He remembered racing there, the mother screaming, other parents combing the grass with flashlights. What he couldn't forget, however, was what happened the following morning. He and another officer had been ordered to stand down. No canvassing, no interviews, no late-night searches through the woods. "We were told the case was already being handled," he explained, bitterness creeping into his voice. "But by who? No one ever said." The investigators leaned closer. His hands trembled as he wrapped them around the coffee cup, his knuckles blotched with age. He described how he'd been assigned perimeter duty near the park. He had expected the scene to be locked down, evidence markers scattered across the mulch, crime scene tape cutting off access. Instead, by mid-afternoon, the tape was gone, children were playing again, and maintenance workers were already moving equipment near the slide. It was like they wanted the place to look normal before anyone started asking too many questions, he said. His words carried the flatness of someone who had told himself the story so many times he no longer needed to dramatize it. When pressed for details, he admitted that shipments had arrived late at night during that week. Unmarked vans pulling up near the service road beside the playground. He remembered being waved away when he approached, a superior officer telling him it was county equipment, but there had been no record of county deliveries. "That was the moment I knew something wasn't right," he confessed. He paused, lowering his voice, glancing at the diner door. "And that was the moment I decided to keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep my job." The investigators asked if he believed the children had been taken away, kidnapped, hidden elsewhere. He shook his head slowly. "No, I think they never left that park." The words hung heavy in the booth, louder than the clatter of plates or the hiss of the grill. For a moment no one spoke. Then he leaned in, his tone sharp, urgent. "They don't like people asking about that door," he whispered. Though no one had mentioned a door, when asked what he meant, he stiffened, shook his head, and refused to elaborate. His eyes darted around the diner as though someone might be listening. After a long silence, he slid out of the booth, leaving his coffee untouched. Before walking out into the parking lot, he placed a folded napkin on the table. On it was scribbled a single phrase in shaky handwriting. "Look at the maintenance logs, July 14th. The investigators sat frozen for a moment, staring at the napkin, listening to the fading squeal of his car tires as he pulled away. What lingered wasn't only his warning, but the fear in his posture, the way decades later he still spoke as if someone, somewhere, was watching. The box looked unremarkable at first glance, a shoebox softened by years of dust and attic heat, its corners held together by brittle masking tape. The cousin, now in her 40s, carried it down carefully, holding it with both hands as though it might disintegrate if she moved too quickly. She admitted she hadn't opened it in years. It had been her way of holding on without letting go, keeping the children alive in fragments she wasn't ready to confront. When she pulled back the lid, the air inside was tinged with the faint must of paper and old fabric, like the residue of a summer long gone. Inside were Polaroids, dozens of them stacked without sleeves or order. Their colors had faded into a palette of yellows and greens, that peculiar way instant film aged. But the scenes were still legible. Birthday cakes with melting candles, a boy holding a plastic water gun, the girl smiling with missing teeth. They were family photographs, ordinary and intimate, never meant for anyone beyond the circle of kin. She spread them across the table, pointing to familiar backdrops, the school steps, the backyard swing, the cracked sidewalk outside the corner store. But then came one Polaroid that halted her movements. The image showed the playground, unmistakably, with the slide in the background. The siblings were there, caught mid-laughter, one climbing the ladder while the other dangled from the bar. Behind them, partially cut off at the edge of the frame, sat a van. Its paint was pale, almost white, but the most striking detail was its absence of plates. The bumper was smooth, unmarked, as though whoever owned it had made sure it carried no identification. The cousin's hand lingered on the photo, her thumb pressing near the blurred shape of the vehicle. "This was taken the week before," she said quietly, though her voice trembled as if doubting her own memory. The date scrawled in ink along the bottom margin, July 6th, 1991, supported her claim. She remembered using a borrowed Polaroid camera at the time, snapping candid shots without thought. She hadn't noticed the van then, but now, with hindsight and knowledge of what came after, the presence of that unmarked vehicle felt like an omen. The investigators leaned in, magnifying the image under a lamp. The van's shadow stretched oddly across the mulch, as if it had been parked closer to the slide than vehicles were supposed to be. Park regulations in 1991 required barriers to keep cars from accessing that area, but in the photo no barrier was visible. If the van was parked that close, it meant either those rules were ignored or the van had permission to be there. Other Polaroids in the stack raised further questions and showed the children at a block party, balloons behind them. Yet a blurred figure lingered at the edge of the frame, tall and dark, facing away. Another revealed the girl wearing the bracelet, the beads catching the flash, proof she still had it just days before she vanished. Each photo became more than memory. It became a piece of evidence, proof of details too easily erased in official reports. As the cousin handled the photos, her voice lowered. She confessed she had kept them hidden because she was afraid they would be taken, just like everything else from that summer seemed to disappear. "We knew people were watching the house back then," she murmured, eyes glassy with old fear. "Cars parked at the corner, headlights off. My mother said not to talk about it. I was a kid, but I remember." The Polaroids, scattered across the table, looked ordinary to the untrained eye, just family mementos. But under the weight of the reopened case, they took on a second life. Each captured frame felt less like a frozen smile and more like a silent witness. And the one with the van, sitting too close to the playground, demanded the loudest questions of all. The first sign of resistance came in subtle ways. A phone call left unanswered by the sheriff's office. Emails returned with form responses. A sudden insistence that all relevant records were released years ago. At first, the investigators chalked it up to bureaucracy, but the pattern sharpened quickly into something less benign. Within a week of the bracelet's discovery and the resurfacing of the Polaroids, the town's leadership called a press conference. Standing stiffly at a podium flanked by uniformed officers, the mayor dismissed the renewed attention as speculative, warning that outsiders were exploiting an old tragedy for clicks and sensationalism. His voice carried the practiced calm of a man reading from a script, not one answering the questions boiling in the town square. Behind the scenes, the pressure grew sharper. Notices arrived in the mail accusing the investigative team of trespassing on municipal property during their site visit. A police cruiser idled for hours outside the motel where they stayed, its presence unacknowledged but unmistakable. One night, when a member of the crew left late, he noticed the same car trailing him until he reached the highway. No lights, no siren, just the quiet reminder that eyes were on him. Locals began to whisper warnings too. A shop owner who had originally agreed to talk backed out, muttering that she'd been advised not to get involved. A retired teacher who had kept one of the original missing posters in her scrapbook, suddenly refused to hand it over, saying she didn't want trouble. Even the cousin who had shown the Polaroids admitted she had received an anonymous letter slipped under her door. It was typed in block letters, unsigned, and read only, "Stop digging. Let the dead rest." The weight of the pushback was felt most in the interviews. Where there had once been curiosity and willingness, now there was hesitation, glances over shoulders, sudden changes of subject. People who had carried these memories for decades seemed frightened into silence again, as though the past was not only painful but dangerous. The investigators noted the shift. The story was no longer about a cold case frozen in time. Someone still cared enough to keep it buried. At the county office, an official pulled one of the team aside in the hallway, his tone low and sharp. "You need to drop this," he said. "There's nothing new here. These stories only stir up grief, and you'll be responsible for it." The words were framed as concern, but the underlying message was clear. Persistence would come at a cost. He refused to clarify who had authorized the second wave of posters, who had approved the unrecorded maintenance, who had signed off on the crawlspace wiring. Instead, he handed back their request forms with "denied" scrawled across the top. The investigators recognized the tactic: deny, discredit, apply pressure until interest fades. But the effort felt too coordinated, too rehearsed. Every unanswered question was not just a gap in the record. It was a wall built deliberately. The bracelet, the Polaroids, the missing files, all of it pointed towards something deeply wrong. And now, with officials stepping in so aggressively, the investigation had crossed a line. It was no longer simply about uncovering what had happened in 1991. It had become about why. 34 years later, certain people were still desperate to keep it hidden. The cassette was found almost by accident. The cousin had remembered an old cardboard box her father once kept in the garage, filled with tools, scraps of wiring, and odds and ends he never threw away. When she went searching through the damp-smelling cardboard flaps, she uncovered a smaller tin wedged at the bottom, rusted around the hinges. Inside lay a cassette tape, its plastic warped slightly with age. The label nearly peeled away. Written in shaky pen was a date: July 12, 1991, just 2 days before the children vanished. The investigators carried it with care, sliding it into a portable tape player they had brought along, uncertain whether it would even play. When the spools began to turn, the hiss of static filled the room. Then came muffled voices. At first it sounded like a routine gathering. The background hum of cicadas bleeding through an open window, chairs scraping against a floor. Then a man's voice, low and firm, cut through. "Keep them there. No one goes near until the switch." The words were clipped, almost rehearsed but unmistakable. Another voice followed, a woman this time, anxious and hurried. "You don't understand. People are already talking. They saw the vans. They'll ask questions." The reply was sharp, almost a bark. "That's why we finish it now." A long pause. Then the faint sound of children's laughter bleeding into the edge of the recording, distant but clear enough to raise the hair on the back of the neck. The tape went on for barely 8 minutes, but every second was heavy. References to maintenance logs and delivery clearances cropped up, terms too bureaucratic to be coincidence. At one point, another man mentioned the phrase, "under the slide," in a way that sounded like shorthand, not explanation. The voices were never identified, but their tones carried authority. They were not panicked neighbors. They were people who believed they had control of the situation. What made the recording most unsettling was its abrupt end. Mid-sentence, the tape cut off with a loud pop, as if the recorder had been stopped abruptly or the tape itself tampered with. There was no natural fade, no conclusion, just a jagged silence that left the listeners staring at one another in the dim light. The cousin explained she had never heard it before. Her father had passed away years earlier, and he never spoke about keeping such a tape. She suspected he had recorded it himself, perhaps by accident, perhaps on purpose. He had been a meticulous man, the type who tinkered with radios and left notebooks filled with schematics. It was possible he had picked up the conversation on a scanner, or maybe he had placed the recorder somewhere near the park that night. Whatever the case, he had hidden it away, leaving it to be discovered decades later. The investigators replayed it several times, straining to make out background noises, a car door slamming, the faint trill of a payphone bell, the thud of boots on concrete. Each detail added texture, placing the recording firmly in its time. The cassette was no mere curiosity. It was evidence, raw and haunting, that someone had known far more than the official story ever admitted. But with the discovery came a chilling realization. If this tape had been hidden for so long, if it contained voices giving orders just days before the disappearance, then someone else might still know it existed. And if that was true, retrieving it now may have just painted a target on anyone who dared to listen. They returned to the playground after midnight, the cassette's cryptic words still looping in their heads. The park was empty, the new slide gleaming faintly under the glow of a single street lamp. The town had gone quiet hours earlier, but here, in the heart of the old case, the silence felt staged, almost oppressive. The investigators moved carefully, their flashlights throwing long, thin beams across the mulch. Each creak of wood, each rustle of leaves overhead, seemed louder than it should have been. The cassette had repeated that phrase. Under the slide, it was too specific to ignore. They crouched near the base of the structure, running gloved hands along the bolts and panels. Much of it was modern, replaced during the recent rebuild, but the soil beneath was older, darker. Packed from decades of compression, they pushed at the ground with trowels, and the first few inches turned up only loose chips of wood and gravel. Then came something harder. One of them struck against metal. It was faint but distinct, a dull clink buried just beneath the surface. Their pulses quickened. Working faster now, they cleared away the soil until a flat surface emerged. It wasn't a pipe as one had guessed. It was a hatch. A rusted sheet of iron no bigger than a door, its edges fused with earth and roots, almost camouflaged against the ground. A single ring handle sat at its center, corroded but still intact. They stared at it, caught between dread and compulsion. This was no ordinary part of a playground foundation. The cassette's voice echoed in their minds. "Keep them there." The investigators gripped the handle, straining to lift, but the hatch resisted. It hadn't been opened in decades. With effort, they wedged a crowbar beneath the seam, the screech of bending metal shattering the silence of the park. For a moment they thought the noise might summon someone, that a car might suddenly appear on the service road. But the night held. When the hatch finally gave, a stale draft of air rose up, carrying with it the unmistakable odor of mildew and rust. Their flashlights cut into the void, revealing a ladder that descended into darkness. The rungs were pitted with age, but still sturdy. Below, faint outlines of concrete walls hinted at a chamber that shouldn't exist beneath a children's playground. The realization hit hard. Someone had built this deliberately, and someone had kept it hidden. They lowered themselves cautiously, one at a time, boots clanging against the metal ladder. The chamber was larger than expected, a low-ceilinged room of poured concrete, perhaps 10 feet square. The walls were unpainted, damp streaks running down from the corners. In the beam of light, objects emerged. A folding chair collapsed against the wall. A pile of burlap sacks rotted through with holes. The faint glimmer of glass shards scattered across the floor. And there, pressed into one corner, was something more deliberate, a stack of binders. Swollen from moisture, their labels faded. The spines bore numbers instead of titles, written in the same neat hand. They flipped one open, careful not to tear the fragile pages. Inside were sheets stamped with county seals, referencing repairs and deliveries to the park in July of 1991, dates that had never appeared in official records, pages that contradicted the story told to the public. The chamber hummed with a kind of oppressive silence, as if the air itself carried the weight of secrets. Every detail reinforced the same question: why would these materials be hidden here, under a place where children played? The investigators exchanged glances heavy with unspoken recognition. This wasn't just evidence, it was proof of intent. someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury the truth. Quite literally, as they climbed back into the night air, dragging with them one of the binders, they knew they had crossed into dangerous territory. The hatch clanged shut behind them, echoing too loudly in the quiet park. What lay below was no longer hidden, and whoever had once guarded it might not appreciate that it had finally been disturbed. The cousin sat in her living room with the blinds drawn, the Polaroids and the copy of the binder spread across the coffee table in front of her. She hadn't wanted to see the documents, not really, but when the investigators showed her the stamped pages, something in her face broke. She reached for a cigarette she never lit, rolling it between her fingers like an anchor. The pages were dated July 14th, 1991, the very day after the children vanished, and referenced site clearance. Complete. Her voice cracked as she read the words aloud. Complete. Like they were closing the book before it was even opened. She sank back into the sofa, eyes fixed on a point far away. Then the memories began to unspool. She spoke of that July, of how the heat had pressed down like a punishment, of how her aunt had screamed until her voice was raw, the night the children disappeared. The cousin had been only 12 then, watching adults unravel around her. She remembered the neighbors showing up with casseroles they didn't eat, the way her father stayed outside late, chain-smoking as if the smoke itself could hold back the grief creeping in. Her words grew more fragile as she recalled the weeks after. It was like the world turned its back on us, she said softly. She remembered being told not to talk at school, not to answer questions from other kids. There were whispers in the halls, cruel and sharp, about what might have happened, about how her family must know more than they were. Saying, she remembered, sitting on the swing at recess, clutching the chain so tightly her palms blistered, wondering why her cousins weren't swinging beside her anymore. What stayed with her most was a single night, a week after the disappearance. She had woken in her room to see headlights sweeping across the curtains. A car had idled outside the house for almost half an hour. She hadn't told anyone at the time, convinced she'd imagined it. But the fear she felt in her chest then returned now. As she whispered, "They wanted us quiet." Even then, they wanted us quiet. Her eyes fell on the Polaroid again, the one with the van. She traced the outline of the blurred vehicle with her finger. "I keep thinking about that bracelet," she admitted. "She never took it off. She used to tell me it was lucky that it would keep her safe. I believed her. We were kids and I believed her." Her voice wavered, caught between anger and grief. "And now it comes back in the dirt, like it was waiting for someone to care again." For a moment the room was still, the only sound the hum of an old refrigerator in the kitchen. She turned to the investigators, her expression both pleading and fierce. "You can't stop now." "I don't care what they say, what they threaten. If we let this go, then they win again, and they've already taken too much." The rawness of her words filled the space more forcefully than any document or artifact could. It was not just evidence now, it was memory, pain, and the relentless echo of a loss that had never been allowed to heal. And it underscored what was at stake. This was not only about proving what happened. It was about giving the lost children and the family left behind the dignity of truth. The binder was heavier than it looked, swollen from years underground, its spine warped with damp. The investigators laid it open on a plastic-covered table, each page turned with gloved care. The county seal was stamped neatly across the top of multiple sheets, alongside typed entries that read like any other maintenance report. At first glance it seemed mundane, notes on playground equipment, soil grading, contractor visits. But the dates told a different story. The most glaring entry was July 14th, 1991, the day after the siblings disappeared. The report stated, "Clearance completed. Slide area secured. Awaiting final sign-off." It carried the initials of a supervisor whose name appeared nowhere in the public record of the case. In fact, cross-referencing revealed that the individual wasn't even listed as employed by the county that year. He simply did not exist on paper. Other entries compounded the strangeness. On July 10th, a note recorded an after-hours delivery of structural supplies, yet no invoices or county Purchase orders from that month mentioned such a delivery. A separate page, dated July 12th, listed temporary access granted. Service vehicles permitted beyond. Barrier. This aligned chillingly, with the Polaroid showing the van, who parked closer to the slide than rules allowed. It was not a child's coincidence. It was written into the logs as if sanctioned. More troubling still were the handwritten annotations in the margins. At least 3 entries bore faint pencil marks, arrows, underlines, and one word, scrawled beside an asterisk: containment. The handwriting was sharp, angular, rushed. It didn't match the typed neatness of the reports. Someone had added it later, but not casually. It was a deliberate insertion, an attempt to track or remind. The investigators documented everything, photographs of every page, cross-checked against the county's publicly archived maintenance records. The discrepancies were glaring. Where the binder mentioned dates in July, the public records simply skipped. No mention of playground work between May and September of 1991, as if the month had been erased entirely. One of them noted the paper itself, thin, almost translucent, with watermarks that had been discontinued by the county in the mid-90s. That meant the binder was authentic, not some later fabrication. It carried the textures of its time, down to the ink bleeding faintly through from the typewriter ribbons. And yet, despite its authenticity, it had been hidden under the playground instead of filed in any known archive. The implications were suffocating. Someone with authority had both created these records and made sure they never saw daylight. They weren't sloppy. The binder was precise, catalogued, almost meticulous, which begged the question, why preserve the evidence if the goal was concealment? Why not destroy it outright? The room where they worked grew quiet as the possibilities settled. The binder wasn't just paperwork. It was a map, one that pointed directly to the mechanics of a cover-up. Delivery sanctioned, access granted, clearances signed by men who officially didn't exist. A framework was in place, systemic, cold, and calculated. And the phrase in the margins, that single word, sat like a stain across every page: containment. It was not the language of playground maintenance. It was the language of control. And in the context of 2 vanished children, it suggested something far more chilling than negligence. They carried photocopies of the binder pages into the county office, each sheet sealed in plastic sleeves. The air inside the building was stale with the weight of bureaucracy, echoing footsteps. The low hum of fluorescent lights, the faint tang of toner. Behind the reception desk, the clerk stiffened when she saw the documents, her professional smile faltering for just a moment before she directed them upstairs to the superintendent's office. That brief flicker of recognition was the first sign they had touched something raw. The superintendent, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with a practiced politician's grin, greeted them with exaggerated warmth. He ushered them in, closed the door, and gestured to the chairs across from his desk. The investigators spread the binder copies out carefully, their voices steady as they explained what they had uncovered beneath the playground hatch. At first he chuckled lightly, dismissing the discovery as misfiled archival junk, but his tone wavered when they pointed to the dates entries logged during a period the county's public records claimed had no maintenance at all. His grin thinned. He adjusted his tie, leaned back, and said flatly, "You have no idea how much trouble you're courting by dragging these ghosts out." He framed it as a warning cloaked in paternal concern, but the sharpness in his eyes betrayed something else: unease. The investigators pressed on, highlighting the phantom employee, initials and the phrase containment scribbled in the margins. That was when his mask slipped. His jaw clenched, his voice tightened, and he said, "Those terms don't mean what you think they do. And those materials were never meant to leave county custody." The room chilled. He had admitted, however obliquely, that he knew the documents existed. One of the investigators noted his slip aloud, and the man's demeanor hardened. "I'll give you one chance to walk away," he said, his tone no longer friendly. "The story is finished. The family's moved on. Stirring it now only brings them pain. Do you want that on your hands? The exchange ended abruptly. A uniformed officer entered, summoned under the guise of escorting them out. The investigators gathered their copies, refusing to leave the originals behind, and walked out under the weight of eyes following them down the corridor. Outside, the summer air felt heavier, almost oppressive, as though the walls of the county office had expelled them like intruders. Back at their car, they noticed something unsettling, a black sedan idling 2 spaces away. Engine running, windows tinted too dark to see inside. It didn't move as they pulled out, not at first. But when they reached the main road, its headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, steady and unblinking. They had expected pushback, but this was no longer bureaucratic obstruction. It was surveillance, calculated and silent, reminding them that they were being watched. The contradictions in the logs had rattled the official narrative, and their confrontation with the superintendent had cracked its surface further. But now the stakes were clearer than ever. This wasn't just about missing paperwork or forgotten files. There were people alive here and now, determined to keep the truth sealed, and by bringing the binder into daylight, the investigators had declared war on that silence. It surfaced from the back of an old cedar chest, tucked beneath layers of yellowed linens. The cousin had forgotten it was even there until she went searching for family photographs to ground herself. After the county confrontation, at the bottom of the chest was a small composition notebook, its cover frayed at the edges, marbled black and white. Inside, the handwriting belonged to her aunt, the mother of the missing children. The entries began in the spring of 1991, meandering thoughts about school schedules, grocery lists and church events. Ordinary life, unremarkable in its routine. But as the pages turned closer to July, the tone shifted. On June 29th, she wrote, "They've been working late at the park again. Trucks with no markings. Said they're fixing the slide, but it looks fine to me. The kids want to play there, but I told them to wait." A week later, strange man came to the house asking about the children. Said he was with the county's survey, but why would they need the kids' names? He left too quickly. I don't like it. By July 10th, the entries carried the tightness of someone unsettled. 3 vans last night. Headlights off, parked by the service road. I heard them after midnight, voices clanging like metal. Tried to call the sheriff, but the line just rang. Her words were underlined twice, pen pressing deep into the page. Then came July 12th, the date written on the cassette. The handwriting slanted sharply. Frantic. Saw men by the slide while the children played. Told them to leave, they said it's county work. But why at dusk? Kids were scared. Son's name asked me if they were in trouble. I told him no, but I don't know anymore. A small sketch was scribbled in the margin, a rectangle, with an X in the center, resembling a hatch. The final entry, dated July 13th, chilled the investigators as they read it aloud. Bracelet missing this morning. Daughter's name, swore she had it last night. She cried until she fell asleep. Strange noise near the park again. Something humming low like a generator. I told husband we need to keep them home tomorrow. We argued. He said it was fine. I don't feel safe. There were no further pages. The notebook ended abruptly, as though her pen had been stilled the next day by what followed. The cousin's hands shook as she turned the book toward the investigators. Tears pooled in her eyes, her voice breaking. She knew. She knew something was happening. The words carried the weight of hindsight, the unbearable knowledge that warnings had been written down but never acted on. The notebook reframed everything. The mother hadn't been blind to the strange activity. She had seen the vans, the workers, the noises, and the missing bracelet. She had tried to capture her unease in ink, as though leaving breadcrumbs for someone else to follow. And now, 3 decades later, those breadcrumbs led directly back to the sealed chamber beneath the slide, and the phantom entries in the maintenance logs. The discovery did more than confirm suspicions. It gave voice to the one person silenced most brutally by the tragedy. The mother who had lost both her children in a single day and never saw them again. Her words, fragile on lined paper, felt more damning than any official document. They spoke not with the cold detachment of bureaucracy, but with the raw, human fear of a parent who sensed something terrible circling her family. The leak was not planned. One of the investigators had shared a copy of the mother's journal pages with a trusted contact, hoping only for a second opinion. But within days, excerpts appeared online in a regional news blog. The shaky handwriting reproduced in grainy scans. 3 vans last night. Headlights off. Parked by the service road. The words, stripped of context, spread like wildfire. Larger outlets picked it up. Local radio hosts speculated on air. And within a week, the small town found itself dragged into the center of national scrutiny. By the time a press conference was called, the courthouse steps were crowded with cameras and microphones. Reporters shouted questions, thrusting recorders into the faces of county officials who had, for decades, buried the case beneath silence. The superintendent, pale and tight-lipped, denied knowledge of the journal entirely. "There is no record that such documents were ever submitted into evidence," he declared, his voice cracking at the edges. Yet the public had already seen the words, and denial rang hollow. The cousin stood in the crowd, holding one of the original Polaroids, the one with the unmarked van, as though it were both shield and weapon. She hadn't intended to speak. But when a journalist approached, asking if she believed her aunt's warnings had been ignored, something inside her gave way. "Ignored," she said, voice trembling but clear. "They weren't ignored. They were buried. My family was made to feel crazy for even asking questions. And now the proof comes up 30 years later in the dirt where children used to play. Tell me that's coincidence." Her words rippled through the assembly, carried on live feeds and news tickers across the country. In the days that followed, the fallout deepened. Activists demanded the playground be closed until a full excavation could be conducted. Parents, angry and frightened, pulled their children from summer programs. An emergency town hall turned hostile when residents confronted the mayor about why. Maintenance logs and personnel records had been scrubbed. Shouts of cover-up and "we want answers" drowned out his prepared remarks. The tension was no longer confined to whispered conversations, in diners or quiet interviews behind drawn blinds. It was in the open now, boiling in public view. But visibility brought danger too. Anonymous emails poured into the investigators' inboxes, some praising their persistence, others seething with threats. One message read simply, "You've taken this too far. Leave it or you'll wish you had." They could not trace its origin. The black sedan reappeared more frequently, parked just out of reach, always watching. And yet, the momentum could no longer be stopped. The revelations had struck a nerve that stretched beyond the town itself. Commentators linked the case to a wider pattern of missing children from the early 90s, drawing parallels, weaving threads. National outlets began running specials, flashing side by side images of the bracelet and the Polaroid van while anchors asked, what else is still hidden beneath official stories? For the cousin and the family left behind, the noise was overwhelming. Decades of private grief had been pulled onto a stage lit by television cameras. There was no longer the luxury of silence. Their tragedy had become public currency, debated by strangers, dissected for ratings. Yet beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, a sense, for the first time in years, that the world was finally listening. Winter had settled over the town by the time the memorial was held. Snow clung to the edges of the playground, now cordoned off with orange barriers and temporary fencing. The slide stripped away to reveal the bare earth beneath. Excavation crews had already begun their work in the weeks prior, and though officials insisted the digging was only precautionary, everyone knew what they were really searching for. The ground itself seemed heavier, carrying the weight of 34 years of silence. Families gathered with candles cupped in their hands, the flames wavering in the cold wind. A makeshift stage had been built where the swings once stood, and at its center a plaque draped in cloth waited to be unveiled. The cousin stood close to the front, clutching the bracelet that had resurfaced months before. She wore it looped around her wrist, though it dangled loose. Made for a child far smaller than her adult frame. When her name was called, she walked forward with slow steps, her breath clouding in the air. Her voice cracked as she spoke. For 34 years, we were told nothing. For 34 years, we were made to doubt our memories. our questions, our grief. Today, we remember not just what was lost, but what was taken from us, the truth. The crowd shifted in silence, some weeping, others holding their candles tighter. The cloth was pulled back to reveal the plaque, 2 names etched into the metal, each framed by simple dates, with an inscription below, "Gone but not forgotten. May the truth one day bring peace." It was both dedication and accusation, a reminder that the case remained unresolved despite the noise and investigations. As the candles flickered, a heavy stillness lingered. People bowed their heads, whispering prayers or standing mute in their own thoughts. For the family, it was closure of a kind, a public acknowledgement that the children had mattered, that they had not simply vanished into a void of neglect. And yet the questions remained. What had been under the slide? Who had driven the vans? Why the logs bore false dates? Why the sheriff's phone rang unanswered? Later that night, after the crowd dispersed, one of the investigators lingered by the excavation site. He crouched by the fence, studying the earth where machinery had carved away at the frozen soil. The hum of generators still buzzed, faintly echoing the mother's last journal entry. He reached down, picked up a shard of rusted metal from the dirt, and turned it in his hand. It looked like part of a latch, maybe from a hatch long since buried. He slipped it into his coat pocket, unsure why. As he walked away, the camera of a news crew left behind for a late segment caught one last image. Stenciled faintly into the metal fragment was a word, barely legible under rust and soil. The letters formed a place name, not local, not familiar. Just 6 letters, Ashrow. It meant nothing to the investigator at first, but it would haunt him later, because it suggested that what happened here was not isolated, that the sealed chamber beneath the slide was not the only one, that the story was not ending, it was widening.